Hey out there, Akronites! Welcome once again to Around Akron with Blue Green. It's the kickoff for Season 3, and we're going to visit some of the oldest icons in the city of Akron. We're going to go over to the north side of Akron and visit the building that once housed the Akron Soap Company. We're going to head over to the west side of Akron and visit the John Brown House. Then we're going to head over to Quaker Square and learn all about that amazing building. Now, to kick this show off, we're going to head to this building right here, built in around 1887. Now, this place built gears for the horse and buggies and was able to transition all the way into airplanes and trucks and was here for over 100 years. Let's go see what this place is all about.
Well over 100 years, this excellent example of bricks and mortar to be crafted for a single purpose, to create an industrial revolution. But the thought lives on. The idea of taking an old building and repurposing it for a variety of uses for future generations, that becomes a major calling card for revitalizing the urban core. It's so important to take our historic building assets and to celebrate our built legacy so that we learn the lessons from yesteryear, but we begin to apply those same principles and practices into the future, and our new ideas become reality and relevant for a whole new audience. This building was built out of a spirit of invention and innovation. Ferdinand Selle teamed up with John Hauer. John had a lumber company and Ferdinand Selle had a gear company, and together the two of them got together to make transportation easier and predictable. The transportation mode of the day was stagecoaches, and they had to build and reconstruct wagon wheels. Well, Ferdinand Selle had the idea that he could make a turning radius to create better and safer steering of the carriages, and the idea was embraced by John Hauer. The two of them got together and they built a building right here to our south. It was built in the early 1880s, and it was equidistant to many metropolitan areas. People between New York and Chicago would travel here to get their wagon wheels prepared. The science of transportation evolved nicely as they were doing steering mechanisms that would eventually get led into a partnership in Detroit. So the folks there would think in terms of how to make steering mechanisms for the new Model A's coming out. That evolved into creating, again, a spirit of invention and innovation by creating fuel gauge and sending units for fuel combustion engines. So we have a rich history in this building of taking ideas from thought to action. Ferdinand Selle teamed up with John Hauer. John Hauer teamed up with Henry Ford. Henry Ford, of course, was involved with Harvey Firestone, and the story just began to blossom. They also took on a very important role in aviation transportation as they were developing mechanisms for the dirigibles. It furthered on into World War II, where they were building pieces and parts for the Corsairs. So we have a rich legacy of historic buildings dating from the 1880s, Building 1, Building 2, which is 1904 that we're standing in, to Building 3, which is really an industrial warehouse that was brought here pieces and parts from Dayton during World War II to create aircraft for that victory. So we celebrate big ideas, and we celebrate putting ideas into action at this place that is imbued with a rich history of invention and innovation right here at the Selle Generator Works. Well, this property is smartly located right at the south entry portal to downtown, so you really can't miss it as you're coming up Broadway. I like to think in terms of being on stage, this building is. It's got a 70-foot square smokestack that just beams up from a wonderful grouping of historic buildings. So the location is smartly positioned. To our west here, we have Browse McDowell in the AES building, and we have the Gojo corporate campus here, their world headquarters, and a whole series of great buildings around us. But the real joy was coming into the building and finding the rich patina of old growth timbers here that were probably started growing before the independence, the Declaration of Independence was signed. Seeing bricks and mortar that was laid in the mid-1800s, the craftsmanship, the attention to detail, and the stability of a building that was built for multiple generations. It's exciting to think in terms of how the buildings were built and then figuring out ways to make them continue to be very significant for new groups coming in. The treasures that are here are a series of interesting old mechanisms that were pre-electric. There was the power sources were generated here internally. They had big steam boilers that would run belts, that would run tools. Over 100 workers would be laboring on this campus, and they would be creating pieces and parts, all types of metal for steering mechanisms and for the rubber industry that was burgeoning around them. So the building continues to speak to us. In the first visit here, it just said, "Please help me stay out of a landfill." So that's really the calling card. Plywood and graffiti. Peel that back off and then rediscover the rich patina of the solid building materials are there, and then figure out a way to reinvent them. It's really a joyful journey.
Next up, this building right here in the valley on the north side. Built in 1893 and originally housed the Akron Soap Company. They help clean up Akron and the rest of the country. Let's go see what this place is all about.
As I walked in the building, I'm the kind of person that I didn't see the decay and the trash that was around me. I saw walls going up and people coming in and life coming back into it. So it was a very electric experience kind of when you first came in for that first walkthrough for me, because I saw what was possible here. The Akron Soap Company was, they built this building in 1893. They had been around for a while before that. A gentleman by the name of Adam Duncan was the owner of the soap company, and it's an interesting how Akron kind of builds upon the successes of the past, and I know he got some people to participate in this project, and I believe it was some of the people from the Robinson Clay Factory that were investors in the first building of this. But they had been around town for a while, and Adam's father, I think, had a soap company in Cleveland, and they needed to be bigger because they were becoming very successful. And they needed a space, so they came down here and built this building. But in those days, to make soap, they would render animal trimmings or roadkill even sometimes to get the fats, and that's how they made the soap. So imagine that kind of a process in the heat of like August, in this low valley, and the smell would kind of roll out of here and settle across the valley. And they were, if you look back through the public records, Adam Duncan was continually being dragged into mayor's court as a public nuisance for like 10 years. And after about 10 years, the city actually ran them out of town, so they were too much of a problem for the residents and people nearby, so they weren't allowed to stay here. In those days, it was obviously pre-electricity, and so they didn't have any kind of fancy filtering stuff. And there was a train that ran right alongside of the building, so the building was designed, if you look at the outside, there's doors repeated on both sides of the building actually, but the train kind of pulled up on the one. But the doors would have opened exactly where the boxcar doors would have opened, so they'd pull stuff in, all the doors on the train open, they bring stuff in, they move stuff out, and it was kind of set up that way. In the back kitchen area there's also a big piece of equipment on the ceiling that was the engine for a freight elevator. So they would bring stuff in right on the freight elevator and take it right up to the third floor. And from there they would use the process, they would use gravity to help make it. So as the product became more finished, it moved down through the floors and eventually shipped back out of the lowest level when it was done. The soap company only lasted about 10 years, and then it was a cereal mill, part of the Schumacher's empire. They did mostly animal feed, though, through this facility, and that only lasted about 10 years, and then it became a paint factory for probably 40-some years. And there's a lot of really interesting Akron history that's tied to that. The paint company was owned by a guy named Carl Pockrant. Carl had a retail store over on Howard where he sold paint, and during the boom when Akron was one of the fastest growing cities in the world, he was selling the paint that painted most of the homes that were being built, and he was making so much paint that his suppliers couldn't keep up, so he bought this facility and said, I'm just gonna make my paint myself, in which he did until about 1953. The exterior of the building is brick. It's at least a minimum of 3 courses of brick thick, and they have spaces in the center, and that's how they kind of did insulation. Most of the building was restored as close as we could get it. There were only 2 original windows that were here and then 1 set of doors, but all of the other doors and windows were patterned after what was here, in addition to what we could tell from an old engraving we found from like 1916. Which showed the type of windows that were in place. Most of the window openings were even bricked in or filled in with something else, so there was a lot of work that had to be done to prepare the brick to receive the new windows and to prepare the windows to go in. And it's interesting too, if you look back at the old engraving, this was a factory, but the original windows that were here were, the windows are called 4/4, so there's 4 panes of glass on the top and 4 panes on the bottom. And those were in this front corner over here, which are now the men's rooms, but those were the original offices. And in those days, the bigger the pane of glass, the more expensive it was. So the office got the bigger glass, where the rest of the factory had 12/12 windows. So we tried to restore that back to actually what the configuration was originally. So now this building is coming back to life in terms of a creative energy space. It currently houses White Space Creative, which is an integrated marketing company. It also houses the Akron Recording Company, which is in the basement down here, and they are a newer company that they're focused on doing analog recording for bands and things like that, so it's a really interesting use of space there. In addition, the warehouse is attached, and we have future plans to install an art gallery, which may be open within the next 6 months or so, we hope. A public access printing studio, which will have letterpress type of equipment and silkscreen for like crafty printing, but meant to be a community asset. And then the goal is to kind of develop that space further into housing more creatives in a live, work, play environment.
Let's go see what the John Brown House is all about.
From the historical information, what we know is that besides the portage path running in front of it and the stagecoach route running to the side of it, which we know today as Copley Road, there was an inn on the corner. And so this house most likely was a rental. And so it was built in 1830. It was rented by a variety of different people. Actually, between 1835 and 1837, it was rented by Colonel Simon Perkins and his wife Grace. So they brought their daughter Anna here, and then their son George Todd Perkins was born here. And so it was in 1844 that Colonel Perkins was able to purchase this property, and then that's when he developed his relationship with John Brown. And so that is when John Brown came to this particular house at that time. And it's hard to tell it now because the house has been owned by people over the different generations and been added onto to make it, amenable and comfortable. But these hardwood floors that we see here in this house, these were the floors that were here when John Brown lived here. And so yes, they've been here since the 1830s, 1840s. Even though the shell of the house has changed, that the main structure, the main body of it is one of the oldest structures actually in this area. The first person to mark the path actually was George Todd Perkins, that Perkins son that was born in this house. He has a stone outside the fence by the Perkins Stone Mansion, and that is a distinction of land holdings between the United States and what were to be Indian lands, was what they called them at that time. So it really was a boundary. and it was a negotiation area for treaties. I mean, it's hard to imagine what life would have been like in this area, even before Ohio becomes a state. And even as Ohio becomes a state, we know that people would be on their sacred journey walking on this landscape. And so we used to share the story as if you're at the Perkins Mansion, you were on land that was owned by the United States. If you're here at the John Brown House, you're on land that was Native American land. I think the piece about John Brown that most people don't understand is that he lived the majority of his life in what we today call Summit County. So knowing that Summit County wasn't formed until 1840, you have that in the back of your brain. You know that John Brown came here when he was 5, so they moved to the town of Hudson because his father wanted them to be in an abolitionist community. So he grew up in Hudson, and then as he aged, he married and he went to Pennsylvania. When that wife died, he came back. He lived in Hudson again for a little while. He got involved in Franklin Mills, which is our neighboring county, Portage County. And then he was paying off a debt working in Richfield at Mr. Oviatt's farm. So that's when he connected with Colonel Simon Perkins to become his shepherd here on Mutton Hill. And so together they raised 1,300 to 1,500 Saxony Merino sheep on this property. And they were so well known that they received awards throughout the local area, the state, the nation, and then internationally. And so from here, he had a very interesting opportunity to go to Springfield, Massachusetts and set up a warehouse for Perkins and Brown with the wool business. He committed his life to ending slavery, and he was a well-known abolitionist, having saying when Elijah Lovejoy's establishment in Alton, Illinois was burned down, that he would consecrate his life to ending slavery. He had already made that statement when he started working for Perkins. And so everything that he did, it didn't matter if it was for the wool business, it was to help end slavery. So he was actually harvesting freedom seekers on those trips for Perkins back and forth to the East Coast. And while he was in Springfield, Massachusetts with their warehouse, he was connecting with people like Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Henry Box Brown, and others to find a way to help end slavery. And so it was very interesting because we look at him in many perspectives. Many people think of him as that terrorist, which relates to the Harper's Ferry raid, and that's at the end of his life in 1859. But here in Akron and in Summit County, they knew him as a shepherd, as a father of 20 children, as an individual that dedicated his life to a cause. And so it was through this establishment here in Akron that he lived in this house off and on from 1844 to 1854. There are a couple of things I'd like to mention is that we are designated through the National Park Service, so we're on the Network to Freedom for the Underground Railroad, and there's oral history that says that there were dark faces on this side of the fence. I mean, that's quoting directly from the letters from the family. So we want people to recognize that John Brown wasn't just a conductor, but also brought people to his house. And for what we know in the histories, he also brought them to his table. He invited them to sit in his church pew, and that was a lot different than other abolitionists, and that's a piece, that's a human side that we want people to know about him, because he was interested in equality for all, for African Americans, for Native Americans, and that his concept of equality was probably much different than others of his time period. And it was actually Frederick Douglass that said one of the poorest homes he'd ever been in was that of John Brown, and that's because their purpose was for helping others. And that's a piece that I think that you need to know the heart of this individual. He's a very complex man. Some people say he was insane. He was a madman, terrorist. But I think that from this house, one of the things that I like people to recognize is that he was a father and he was a resident, and he really had compassion. And Thoreau, I think, had it right, is he describes Brown as an angel of light.
Now, to wrap this show up here today, we're at Quaker Square. This place holds a soft spot in my heart. When I attended the University of Akron, this is the first place that I went to in Akron. Let's go see what Quaker Square is all about.
So when I was a kid, our family, it was the thing to do to come down to the REA Depot for our birthdays. So we would go in and watch them make our pizzas, and whenever the trains would go by, all of the bells and whistles would go off inside of the restaurant, and then we go upstairs and see the train exhibit, and then come on over here and go over to the ice cream parlor that was here at the time and enjoy an ice cream sundae for our birthday. Originally, the oats and the grains were used to feed your animals on the farm. While the Civil War came to the U.S., many troops that needed to have something they could eat that was going to be inexpensive and quick to fix. So I think it was the Schumacher company at the time, but Quaker Oats sold the idea of oatmeal being an excellent food source for the troops. So they could ship it out in large quantities by train all across the eastern part of the U.S. And then the soldiers would have a wholesome breakfast or a meal that all they had to do is add hot water and maybe a little bit of sweetener, and they tended to like it.
What we now know as Quaker Square began with a fire. In March of 1886, Ferdinand Schumacher's milling enterprise at Broadway and Mill Streets burned down. He was unable to afford to rebuild on his own, so he formed a partnership with some other businessmen to rebuild, and that became known as the F. Schumacher Milling Company, and eventually through mergers and acquisitions became Quaker Oats. The oldest buildings in Quaker Square are the brick side of the complex, and my office is on the 4th floor of the old cleaning and drying building, which was built in 1886. The rest of the brick buildings were added in 1894 and 1912. The elevator dates to the 1930s, and the silos were added in the 1940s. In 1973, Quaker Square Associates bought the buildings. The renovated complex opened in April of 1975. They were inspired by the adaptive reuse, such projects as Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco, and they decided to turn the mill side of the complex into shops and restaurants. The mill side of the complex was shops and retail, but the silo side of the complex, which was originally going to be apartments, and they later decided to turn it into a hotel, and that opened in 1980. The University of Akron bought it in 2007, and now it's a dorm, so students have the opportunity to live in a silo.
So when J. Nussbaum and Quaker Associates bought this property, there was still a lot of the equipment, the milling equipment here. So huge gears and belts and different items that would sort and process the grain. So a lot of that's been incorporated into the building exhibits. But at the time when this was being renovated, the famous in Akron artist Don Drum was asked to come in and design art within the lobby of the hotel. So he incorporated those huge gears and some of the other items that were found in the complex into that art. Schumacher's restaurant in the lobby of the hotel. It always served the traditional Quaker Oats for breakfast, and it had more traditional kind of hamburger or classy foods. And then you had your trackside grill that had more of the hobo type chicken dinner. Or you can go across the way and they had the REA Depot restaurant. And then down below here in what was the shops area is the Tavern on the Green, and that was your date night restaurant, the more formal, I'm gonna go here to celebrate my anniversary. The other stores that were here that I recall were the newsstand. There was an arcade downstairs for a while. There was the ice cream shop that moved around a couple different places, an ice cream parlor, the old time candy store, which was always a fixture here, the general store, and that evolved over the years too. The general store was the last store to close in the complex here. There were clothing boutique type stores, Honey Gold Perfume that made their own perfume that was very well known in Akron. There was a kitchen boutique store. There was an old time memorabilia shop that had vintage posters and different items. There was a silver jewelry store that sold Aztec type jewelry. There was Buck's Grill that was more of a sports bar kind of theme. And then he had a country western. You could come and do the two-step and enjoy country music, and the food was always themed to go along with the theme of the sports bar. There was Buck's Garage, which was kind of down in the basement, and that one had airplane on the ceiling and parts of cars on the wall. And then there was at one point a Mardi Gras kind of bar that was here for a while too. You know, every couple of years a different themed bar would go in, and that way everyone kept on coming down to check out the new things happening at Quaker Square.
Thank you for watching this episode of Around Akron with Blue Green. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or just want to say hey, you can reach me on the website at www.aroundakronwithbluegreen, or you can catch me on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter. Thanks for watching, and have an amazing day.